So a short history of how we've made progress in wetlands. And one of the things that we've had is a measurement of how many acres we've lost over the years. And so starting back in the, looking back to the mid-50s, and Bill, I don't know where those aerial photographs from the mid-50s exactly came from, but we've had estimates of wetland loss. So from the, you can see 500,000 acres a year made headlines for a long time. And so much of early wetlands policy was hinged on this idea that we were losing enormous amounts of wetlands on an annual basis. And moving forward, those numbers have dropped until, if you looked in the year 2006, we declared success. And Bill called me up one time concerned that here we were, we'd achieved no net loss, and nobody was cheering about it. And so and in fact, they were complaining about the fact that we'd been counting golf courses and farm ponds and ornamental ponds and developments as gains going back to the 1950s. But that was the story, that these artificial man-made water features on the landscape were needed in order for us to achieve no net loss. And my response to Bill was that no, this was a sign of success, that they'd been featured, this sort of perspective had been featured in the Colbert Report, on the late night talk shows on NPR, and that, as we saw in the last presidential campaign, in order to get your ideas across, you have to show up on all of these venues to be recognized. But the other part of that is in 1990, if we declared no net loss and included ponds and golf courses and other things, people would have said, so what? Their idea of what a wetland was, I'm sure, was not sophisticated enough to know that a farm pond and a golf course pond was not a wetland. So the public's understanding of what the objective was had also changed over time. So you couldn't map wetland losses without having maps to be able to go back and take a look at various wetlands. So another really important thing that occurred over time is there were boundaries around these wetlands. You could see where they were on the landscape, and you could make maps of them. And although wetland mapping has had many of the same challenges or different challenges than mapping floodplains, nevertheless, that effort to go out and map and provide a boundary and make a wetland a thing that you could look at and measure loss was absolutely key, I think, to being able to move ahead in having some kind of wetland policy. And a couple of things that have happened. One with the loss in wetlands, or going away, is we changed our focus from looking at quantity to quality. And so now in meetings that I go to, when we talk about wetlands, we're not just talking about losses of acres, but how to maintain and improve the quality of those wetlands and measure that. There's been a huge amount of science devoted to that. So once you achieve a goal, you can't stop, because you got to keep going, or else there's a danger of reverting back to those earlier losses. And now we continue to be challenged with doing maps, but we've made progress, and mapping has made progress so that local towns, communities, states can move ahead and do their own wetland mapping. It's not as specialized a science as it was a number of years ago. 1988 was a really big year for wetlands. In 1988, I moved from Wisconsin to Washington, D.C., and at one point I had 3 job offers. I had 2 job offers at EPA and one with a consultant, so I called up my old boss in Wisconsin. I said, well, I can work for a consultant, I can work in groundwater, I can work in wetlands. What should I do? And he said, well, don't work in wetlands. He says, that program's going nowhere. And that was before a number of things happened, and I kind of liked the people in wetlands, and I had a good feeling about it, so obviously that's what I chose to do. But a report that came out that year that we called the Goldstein Report was a report that looked at the federal programs that subsidized or provided incentives for destroying wetlands. And at that point in time, there were quite a few, and I think the only program that had an incentive for saving wetlands was the water bank program over in a very limited number of states over in USDA. And so this report articulated, first for this part of the country and later for certain regions of the country, how the federal government was helping along the destruction of wetlands. The same year, EPA sponsored a National Wetlands Policy Forum which came out with a blueprint for moving ahead on national wetlands policy, and it had a number of recommendations. And it was a lot shorter on the report to Congress on, interagency floodplain management, which I think is about this thick that has been sent up there. It's the forum report is, I think, about 80 pages. Much easier to follow, much simpler, and it included in the report no overall net loss, which was translated to no net loss. Governor Keene from New Jersey, the story that we heard, took a walk one time with President-elect George Bush and talked about the forum report and talked about no net loss, which was adopted by the President-elect and then President when he came into office. And from that, a whole lot of things happened. Mitigation policy, a new delineation manual, and the Wetlands Reserve Program was created in the 1990 Farm Bill. This looks easy in retrospect, looking back, but when the Wetlands Reserve Program was created, the idea that some farmers would want to enroll and restore 1 million acres of wetlands was unimaginable. I can remember being in a meeting with the chief of the Soil Conservation Service, Bill Richards, and hearing him say, there's just no way. There's just no way that we're going to get 1 million acres enrolled in this program in 30 and permanent easements. And now, of course, the Wetlands Reserve Program has enrolled 2 million acres, and it's on its way to enrolling 3 million acres, and there's plenty of demand, particularly for those very wet areas of the floodplain, which it's not profitable to farm. The other thing about incentives is that, a lot of times we talk about economic incentives, but it's important to remember that incentives covers economic incentives, social incentives, and moral incentives. And we make decisions based on all three kinds of incentives. So the economic incentives, of course, make money sense, but there's also how we, as a group or an individual feel about the decisions we make, whether we recycle, whether we, make decisions that are good for society as a whole, and whether we will be embarrassed perhaps by our decisions if our neighbors find out about them, which of course happens more and more frequently with things like Facebook and just all the various ways that people communicate nowadays.